Welcome to A Gentle Guide to the U.S. Presidents, a series designed to carry you through the long, winding journey of American leadership, softly and thoughtfully. Tonight, we begin at the very beginning, with a man who never sought greatness, yet became the cornerstone of a nation, George Washington. So, settle in, allow your shoulders to drop, and let's gently travel back to colonial America. Early life and childhood. George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732, in Westmoreland County in the British colony of Virginia. He was the first child of Augustine Washington and Mary Ball Washington, though not Augustine's firstborn, as he had children from a previous marriage. George grew up on Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg along the banks of the Rappahannock River. His childhood was modest and poor, but not aristocratic, and unlike many of his contemporaries, Washington did not attend college. Instead, he learned mathematics, trigonometry, and surveying through self-study and tutoring. He lost his father at the age of 11, a moment that would alter the course of his life. George's formal education ended early, but his self-discipline and ambition propelled him forward. Early career and military service. In his late teens, George became a surveyor, mapping vast lands across Virginia's rugged frontier. But by 1753, his path shifted. He joined the Virginia militia, just as tensions between the British and French in the Ohio Valley began to rise. At 21, he was sent by Virginia's governor to warn the French to vacate the Ariane experience that thrust him into the heart of colonial geopolitics. Then came the French and Indian War. In 1754, Washington led an ill-fated expedition to Fort Duquesne, though he suffered early setbacks, including the infamous surrender at Fort Necessity. He displayed courage and a sense of responsibility beyond his years. By war's end, Washington had earned the respect of his peers and the valuable experience of commanding men in battle. But he grew disillusioned with British military structureware. Colonial officers were treated as inferior. He resigned his commission in 1758 and returned home. Mount Vernon and personal life. Washington soon turned his attention to Mount Vernon, the plantation he would call home for most of his life. In 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children, though they had no biological children together. George raised Martha's children as his own, and their bond was one of enduring mutual respect. At Mount Vernon, Washington became a successful planter. He grew tobacco, later shifting to wheat, and oversaw many operations on the estate. Yet it's important to acknowledge Mount Vernon was also sustained by the labor of enslaved people. By the time of his death, over 300 enslaved individuals lived and worked at Mount Vernon. Washington's relationship with slavery was complex. While he expressed private misgivings about the institution later in life, he only took the step of freeing the people he enslaved upon his death, through his will. The road to revolution. By the 1760s and 70s, tensions between the colonies and Britain were escalating. Washington, though once loyal to the crown, grew increasingly aligned with the Patriot cause. He served as a delegate to the First and Second Continental Congresses, and when war with Britain became inevitable, he was unanimously appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775. The Revolutionary War. Washington's military leadership was tested time and again. The war was long, grueling, filled with losses, harsh winters, and dwindling resources. Yet Washington's presence held the army together. He led with steadiness, humility, and strategy, crossing the Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, to surprise the Hessians at Trenton, and enduring the harsh winter at Valley Forge. Perhaps his greatest act came not in victory, but in restraint. In 1783, after the British surrender at Yorktown and the end of the war, Washington did something extraordinary. He resigned his military commission and returned to Mount Vernon. In an age when victorious generals often crowned themselves kings, Washington walked away. The presidency begins, but retirement would not last. In 1787, he presided over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, lending his reputation to the birth of a new form of government. And in 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first President of the United States. There were no blueprints, no past presidents to emulate. He was tasked with inventing the presidency, balancing authority with democracy, setting precedents in everything from foreign policy to the peaceful transfer of power. He established a cabinet, avoided monarchical titles, and voluntarily limited himself to 2 terms, a tradition that endured until the 20th century. Notable moments in office: Washington faced enormous challenges. The Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 tested the federal government's ability to enforce laws. He remained neutral during the conflict between Britain and Revolutionary France, despite immense pressure to take sides. His farewell address warned against permanent foreign alliances and the dangers of political factions. His leadership was not without critics, but he remained widely respected even by those who disagreed with him. Final years and legacy: Washington retired once again in 1797, returning to Mount Vernon, where he oversaw his estate and remained a symbol of unity in a growing, divided nation. On December 14, 1799, George Washington died of a throat infection. He was 67 years old. His death was mourned deeply. Both in America and abroad, he left behind no biological children, no titles of nobility, and no personal ambitions unfulfilled. Just a legacy of humility, sacrifice, and service. Closing a whispered reflection as we close this first chapter. Let us remember George Washington, not as a flawless figure carved in stone, but as a man who navigated immense uncertainty with grace, who resisted power when others would have seized it. He was the father of a country still learning to walk, and in his silence, his restraint, he taught us what it meant to lead. Thank you for joining me tonight. I hope this gentle journey brought you knowledge and peace. Good night, and when you're ready, we'll continue with John Adams. Episode 2, John Adams, the Principled Patriot. In this episode, we turn our attention to a man of fierce intellect, unwavering principle, and a legacy that stretches beyond politics, into the very bones of the Constitution itself. Tonight, we meet John Adams. So, let the worries of your day fall softly away. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let's step into history. Together, early life and education. John Adams was born on October 30th, 1735, in the town of Braintree, Massachusetts, now known as Quincy. He was the eldest of 3 brothers. Born to a family of modest means but strong values, his father, a farmer and deacon, hoped John would enter the ministry. But the young Adams had other ideas. At Harvard College, which he entered at just 15, Adams was exposed to classical philosophy, logic, and political theory. He was especially taken by works of Cicero, Plato, and the ideals of republicanism. After graduation, he initially taught school, but soon pursued law, which would become both his profession and his philosophical battleground. Path to revolution. As a lawyer in Boston, Adams earned a reputation for clarity, courage, and a deep commitment to justice. In 1770, he did something that shocked many. He defended British soldiers charged in the Boston Massacre, arguing that even enemies were entitled to a fair trial. It was a deeply unpopular move, but Adams believed that the rule of law must come before the passions of the mob. This unwavering devotion to principle would define his life. He later wrote, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." Continental Congress and Independence by 1774. Adams was a delegate to the First Continental Congress, where his commanding presence and logical mind quickly distinguished him. He played a crucial role in drafting the Declaration of Independence, and it was Adams who famously nominated George Washington to command the Continental Army. Though Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration, it was Adams who fought relentlessly for its passage, rallying hesitant colonies with his powerful oratory. He would later describe July 2nd, 1776, the day Congress voted for independence, as a day that should be celebrated with pomp and fireworks forevermore. A few days later came July 4th, diplomatic missions abroad during the Revolutionary War. Adams was sent to Europe to secure alliances and negotiate treaties in France, the Netherlands, and later Great Britain. He worked to gain financial and political support for the fragile American cause. While abroad, Adams experienced great loneliness and hardship, but he never faltered in his mission. He helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially ended the Revolutionary War. Relationship with Abigail Adams through all of it. John remained deeply connected to his wife, Abigail Adams, of the most remarkable women in American history. Their letters, hundreds of them, reveal a bond built on mutual respect, wit, and shared ideals. Abigail offered advice on governance, women's rights, and social issues. She famously wrote to him, "Remember the ladies." Abigail was not just a supportive spouse, she was his intellectual equal, and the beating heart of his private world, vice presidency, and rise to power in 1789. Adams became the first vice president of the United States, serving under George Washington. It was a frustrating position. He once called it the most insignificant office ever the invention of man contrived. Still, Adams performed his duties faithfully for 2 terms. When Washington declined a 3rd term, Adams ran for president, and in 1796 he was elected the 2nd President of the United States. His opponent and former friend was Thomas Jefferson, who became his vice president under the original rules of the Constitution. Thus began one of the most complex rivalries in American history. Presidency 1797 to 1801. Adams's presidency was marked by tension and division. One of the biggest challenges came from France, which angry over U.S. neutrality in its war with Britain, began seizing American ships. Adams sent envoys to negotiate to the infamous XYZ affair, in which French agents demanded bribes just to begin talks. The nation was outraged. Calls for war grew loud, but Adams held back. He strengthened the navy, prepared for defense, but refused to plunge the country into war. His decision cost him politically, but likely saved countless lives. Adams also signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which aimed to protect national security but infringed on civil liberties and were heavily criticized even by his allies. By 1800, his popularity had waned. He lost re-election to Thomas Jefferson, a quiet departure and reconciliation in a peaceful transfer of power, the first in American history between opposing parties. Adams left Washington, D.C., quietly before dawn on Inauguration Day. He returned to his home in Quincy. In the years that followed, Adams grew more reflective in a beautiful twist of fate. He and Jefferson, once friends, then rivals, began a rich correspondence, exchanging over 150 letters in the twilight of their lives. Death and legacy on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams died at the age of 90. His final words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Unbeknownst to him, Jefferson had died just hours earlier. Two founding fathers, two authors of independence, departing this world together on the nation's 50th birthday. Closing a whispered reflection, John Adams was not the most beloved president, nor the most charismatic, but he was, perhaps, the most principled, a man of deep convictions, of sacrifice, of law and liberty. He gave us a vision of government grounded not in power, but in reason, and though his legacy was once dimmed by politics, time has illuminated his vital role. Thank you for joining me tonight. Next time, we continue with the philosopher-president, Thomas Jefferson. Until then, rest well and dream of history. Episode 3, Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher-president. Tonight, we explore the life of a man who was as much a dreamer as a leader, a writer, a thinker, an architect of ideas and buildings alike. His words helped birth a nation. His contradictions helped define it. Let us journey now to Monticello and the mind of Thomas Jefferson. Early life and education. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, in Shadwell, Virginia, a plantation in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was the third of 10 children, raised in a world of Enlightenment ideals and inherited privilege. From a young age, Jefferson showed a deep curiosity. He studied Latin, Greek, French, mathematics, science, and philosophy. At just 16 years old, he enrolled at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. There, he developed a lifelong love of books and learning, eventually amassing a personal library of nearly 6,500 volumes. He once said, "I cannot live without books." Law and politics. Jefferson studied law under George Wythe, one of the most respected legal minds in the colonies. By 1767, he was practicing law in Virginia, but his mind remained fixed on bigger ideas as colonial tensions with Britain grew. Jefferson joined the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he quietly built a reputation as a principled and articulate voice for independence. Unlike the fiery John Adams, Jefferson was soft-spoken, introverted, and reserved. But when he wrote, he lit sparks, the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Jefferson was selected to draft what would become one of the most important documents in world history, the Declaration of Independence. He wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." With grace and eloquence, Jefferson distilled the revolutionary spirit of the colonies into just over 1,300 words. Though edited and debated, the core of his vision remained intact. He was only 33 years old. Monticello and the contradictions of freedom. Jefferson's home, Monticello, was his personal project, designed and redesigned over decades. Perched on a Virginia hilltop, it reflected his love of symmetry, nature, and neoclassical beauty. But Monticello also reveals the contradiction. At the heart of Jefferson's life, he spoke passionately of liberty. Yet he enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime. Among them was Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman with whom he had several children. Though he expressed discomfort with slavery and called it a moral depravity, he took few steps to abolish it. This tension between Jefferson's ideals and his actions remains central to how we understand him today. Governor, Minister, and Secretary of State. After American independence, Jefferson served as governor of Virginia during the Revolutionary War. Later, he was sent to France as the U.S. minister, replacing Benjamin Franklin. He returned home to serve as the first Secretary of State under George Washington, where he clashed with Alexander Hamilton over the nature of government. Jefferson believed in small, decentralized power, a nation of independent farmers, a light federal touch. He feared monarchy and elitism, and favored personal liberty over government strength. These tensions gave birth to America's first political parties. Vice presidency and election of 1800 in 1796. Jefferson became vice president under his longtime rival, John Adams. It was an awkward pairing, and the two men grew apart as political enemies. But in 1800, Jefferson ran again, this time, defeating Adams in one of the most bitterly contested elections in U.S. history. The race ended in an electoral tie between Jefferson and his own running mate, Aaron Burr. After 36 ballots in the House of Representatives, Jefferson finally emerged as the victor. Power shifted peacefully between parties for the first time in modern history, a moment Jefferson called a revolution in the principles of government. Presidency, 1801 to 1809. Jefferson's presidency marked a return to simplicity. He walked to his inauguration, rejecting royal trappings and ceremonial pomp. His first term was largely successful. He reduced the national debt cut, taxes and military spending, and, most famously, oversaw the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, doubling the size of the United States. He sent Lewis and Clark westward to explore this vast, unknown land, igniting American expansion. But Jefferson's second term was more troubled, facing British and French aggression at sea. He enacted the Embargo Act of 1807, halting all U.S. trade. The policy hurt American merchants and was deeply unpopular. Jefferson, worn and disillusioned, left office in 1809, never to return to public life. Retirement and the University of Virginia in retirement. Jefferson returned to Monticello and devoted himself to education. He founded the University of Virginia, a secular institution rooted in Enlightenment thinking. He designed its buildings, selected the books for its library, and shaped its curriculum. Of all his accomplishments, Jefferson was proudest of three: author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. These are the only words inscribed on his gravestone: not president, not secretary of state, but philosopher, thinker, and educator. Death and legacy on July 4th, 1826. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration he helped write. Thomas Jefferson died at Monticello a few hours later in Massachusetts. John Adams passed away, unaware of Jefferson's death. The two old friends and rivals had reconciled and left this world together. Closing a gentle reflection, Thomas Jefferson was a man of vast intellect and complex contradiction. He expanded the United States, defined its principles, and built institutions that endure to this day. Yet, he also embodied its deepest hypocrisies, proclaiming freedom while denying it to hundreds. He reminds us that even our most brilliant founders were not gods, but human, flawed, and evolving. Thank you for joining me on this quiet walk through history. Next time, we'll meet a hero of the battlefield, a general turned president, James Madison. Until then, rest easy and sleep well. Episode 4. James Madison, the quiet architect of libertine. Now we meet a man often overlooked, soft-spoken, modest, but brilliant. He helped write the U.S. Constitution, defended it in the Federalist Papers, and guided a young nation through war. Tonight, we meet James Madison, the father of the Constitution and the fourth President of the United States. Let's begin. Early life and education. James Madison was born on March 16, 1751, in Port Conway, Virginia. He was the eldest of 12 children, raised on a prosperous tobacco plantation in Orange County. A frail and often sickly child, Madison was small in stature, but large in intellect. He studied under private tutors, then enrolled at the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton University. There he devoured subjects like philosophy, Latin, Greek, political theory, and the works of Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu. By the age of 20, Madison was already thinking deeply about liberty, governance, and the fragility of freedom. A mind for politics after college, Madison returned to Virginia and entered public life. He served in the Virginia Convention, where he worked with Thomas Jefferson to pass the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, a landmark law separating church and state. Madison believed fiercely in individual rights, in freedom of conscience, and limited government. These beliefs would follow him into his most important work, the Constitution. In 1787, Madison arrived in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. At just 36 years old, he was one of the youngest delegates, but also the most prepared. He had studied dozens of political systems, past and present, and brought with him a detailed blueprint for what would become the U.S. Constitution. For months he took copious notes, participated in every major debate, and helped broker critical compromises. Madison believed in a system of checks and balances, where power would be divided between the states and the federal government, and among legislative, executive, and judicial branches. He envisioned a republic where tyranny from monarchs or mobs could never take root. The Federalist Papers after the Constitution was signed. It still needed to be ratified by the states. Many feared this new federal government would be too strong, too distant, so Madison, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, wrote a series of essays under the pen name Publius. These essays, now known as the Federalist Papers, explained, justified, and defended the Constitution. Madison's essays, including the famous Federalist No. 10, warned against the dangers of faction, groups that could divide and destabilize a republic. His words still resonate today. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, but it is a necessary evil of freedom. The Bill of Rights, despite his efforts, many Americans still feared the Constitution lacked protections for individual freedoms, so Madison, once skeptical, changed his mind in Congress. He drafted 12 amendments, 10 of which were ratified. As the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. These rights are Madison's enduring legacy. Secretary of State and the Louisiana Purchase, Madison served as Secretary of State under his longtime friend Thomas Jefferson. During this time, the United States doubled in size with the Louisiana Purchase. Madison also supervised Lewis and Clark's expedition, charting a course into the continent's vast interior. But storm clouds were gathering again. Across the Atlantic, presidency 1809 to 1817. In 1809, Madison became the 4th President of the United States. He inherited rising tensions with Britain, whose navy was seizing American ships and impressing U.S. sailors into service. For years, Madison tried diplomacy. He imposed trade embargoes, hoping to avoid war, but by 1812 the pressure was too great, and so the United States declared war on Britain. The War of 1812. The War of 1812 was a second struggle for American independence, fought on land, at sea, and even within the nation's capital. In 1814, British troops marched into Washington, D.C. They burned the Capitol, the Treasury, and the White House itself. Madison and his wife, Dolly, barely escaped, but Dolly, brave and quick-thinking, famously rescued a portrait of George Washington from the flames. Despite early setbacks, the U.S. ultimately held firm. The war ended in 1815 with the Treaty of Ghent, restoring peace and pride. The Battle of New Orleans, though fought after the treaty was signed, gave Americans a sense of victory and made a hero of Andrew Jackson. Madison's leadership during the war was cautious but steady. He left office in 1817, exhausted but respected. Retirement at Montpelier. In retirement, Madison returned to his estate, Montpelier in Virginia. There he managed his plantation, wrote letters, and stayed engaged in public debates about liberty and governance. He also served as rector of the University of Virginia, continuing his partnership with Jefferson. But as with Jefferson, Madison's legacy is shadowed by contradiction. Though he championed liberty, he enslaved over 100 people. He expressed doubts about slavery, but failed to free them in life or death. Death and legacy. James Madison died on June 28, 1836. At the age of 85, he was the last surviving signer. Of the Constitution, he never sought fame or fortune, but his ideas shaped the framework of American democracy. His vision lives on. In every courtroom, every debate, every ballot cast. Closing a gentle reflection, James Madison was not loud, not charismatic, not larger than life, but he was, perhaps, the most essential of all the founders. He gave the United States a structure, a spine, a soul of law. Thank you for walking quietly with me tonight through the thoughtful, deliberate life of James Madison. Next time we meet a war hero, a bold general, and a man who left an indelible mark on the presidency. Join me as we explore the life of James Monroe. Until then, sleep well and dream softly of liberty. Episode 5. James Monroe, the last founding father. Next, we meet the last of the founding fathers to serve as president, a soldier, a diplomat, a quiet bridge between the revolutionary generation and a rapidly growing republic. This is the story of James Monroe, the 5th President of the United States, and the man behind one of America's most enduring foreign policy doctrines. Let's begin. Early life and revolutionary spirit. James Monroe was born on April 28, 1758, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was raised in a modest but respected planter family, and like many of the founders, educated in the Enlightenment tradition, but his life changed dramatically at the age of 17, when, in 1775, the American Revolution erupted. Monroe left college to join the Continental Army. He fought bravely and was wounded at the Battle of Trenton, a musket ball to the shoulder nearly fatal. He was there when George Washington crossed the icy Delaware and turned the tide of war. This would be the first of many moments, where Monroe quietly stood at history's center. Law, mentorship, and early politics after the war. Monroe studied law under Thomas Jefferson, beginning a lifelong friendship and political alliance. He was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, and later to the Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Monroe opposed the original U.S. Constitution, fearing it gave too much power to a central government. But once it passed, he accepted the will of the people and moved forward. In time, he became a U.S. Senator, then Minister to France, then Governor of Virginia, and again Minister to both France and Britain. He served through diplomacy and disagreement, war and peace, the Louisiana Purchase, and diplomatic challenges as Minister to France. Monroe helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. It was a historic deal, doubling the size of the young nation, but diplomacy was never easy. Later, as Minister to Britain, Monroe tried and failed to prevent rising tensions that would eventually lead to the War of 1812. Still, he remained a trusted figure, often sent abroad to heal rifts and build bridges, Secretary of State and Secretary of War during the War of 1812. Monroe served as Secretary of State under President James Madison. When Washington, D.C. was burned by the British and the young government teetered on collapse, Monroe took on both roles, Secretary of State and Secretary of War. His leadership during the crisis won him widespread respect, and in 1816 Monroe was elected President of the United States nearly unopposed. Presidency 1817 to 1825, the era of good feelings. Monroe's presidency marked a moment of national unity. The bitter partisan battles between Federalists and Democratic Republicans had cooled. This was called the era of good feelings, a time of expansion, optimism, and, on the surface, peace. But beneath the calm, deep issues stirred. Monroe oversaw the Missouri Compromise, a fragile political bargain that allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state. Balanced by Maine as a free state, it was an uneasy truce. Between the forces of slavery and abolition, Monroe believed in maintaining unity above all. But the cracks were showing. The Monroe Doctrine, perhaps Monroe's most lasting legacy, came in 1823, in a speech written largely by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. In his annual message to Congress, Monroe declared, "The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers." This became known as the Monroe Doctrine. It was a bold diplomatic boundary, a statement of independence and influence. The United States, still young and fragile, was now asserting itself as the guardian of the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine would be cited for generations, sometimes to protect, sometimes to justify expansion. Personal life and character. James Monroe was not known for eloquence, nor for charisma. He was thoughtful, deliberate, often quiet. He loved his wife, Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe, deeply. She brought grace to the White House, but her health was fragile. They had 2 daughters and a long, steady marriage. Monroe preferred simplicity to pomp, riding on horseback without escort, dressing plainly, living modestly. He embodied the Republican ideal of virtue over vanity. Later years and legacy. Monroe left office in 1825, having served 2 terms with dignity and peace. But retirement was not easy. He faced financial hardship, debt from years of public service and a struggling plantation. He lived his final years with relatives in New York, and on July 4, 1831, the 55th anniversary of American independence, James Monroe passed away. He was the 3rd president to die on the 4th of July, after Jefferson and Adams. Another chapter closed. With poetic timing, closing a gentle reflection, James Monroe was the last of the Founding Fathers to serve as president, a bridge between revolution and a rapidly industrializing America. He was not loud, not flamboyant, but he was faithful, loyal to the ideals he had fought for in youth. And guided within age, he expanded the nation's borders and declared its independence from European ambition. He gave us peace and left us questions. He gave us the Monroe Doctrine, but also the silence before the storm of civil war. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me, listening, learning, and remembering. Next time, we meet a president born of privilege, molded by intellect, and shaped by family legacy. Join me as we discover the life of John Quincy Adams. Until then, rest easy and sleep well. Episode 6. John Quincy Adams, A Mind for the Republic. Next, we meet a man born into revolution, raised by founders, and destined for public service. a president whose intellect shaped his life, whose conscience shaped his legacy, and whose story stretches far beyond the White House. This is the life of John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, and one of the most brilliant minds ever to hold the office. Let us begin. Born of the Revolution, John Quincy Adams was born on July 11th, 1767, in Braintree, Massachusetts, now known as Quincy. He was the son of John Adams, the future second President, and Abigail Adams, one of the most insightful and educated women of her age. From childhood, John Quincy breathed the air of revolution. He was 8 when the Declaration of Independence was signed, 10 when he watched the Battle of Bunker Hill from a nearby hilltop. His father was abroad much of his youth, serving the cause of diplomacy. But John Quincy was never left behind. At age 11, he traveled to Europe with his father, witnessing the courts of Versailles, the salons of Amsterdam, and learning diplomacy before most boys finished school. He became fluent in French, Dutch, and Latin, and developed a love of history, poetry, and law. The young diplomat, by his early 20s, John Quincy Adams was already serving as a diplomat, appointed minister to the Netherlands by President Washington. Soon after, he served in Portugal, then Prussia. His letters were meticulous, his reports thoughtful. Even Thomas Jefferson once called him the ablest man of his age. In 1802, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, though his independent mind often frustrated his own party. The Federalists, he would vote his conscience, not the party line, a pattern that followed him for the rest of his career. Secretary of State, a master of diplomacy, John Quincy Adams reached the height of his diplomatic power as Secretary of State under President James Monroe from 1817 to 1825. He helped define America's role in the world. He negotiated with Britain. He oversaw the acquisition of Florida from Spain, and he authored the core ideas behind the Monroe Doctrine, though it bears Monroe's name. It was John Quincy Adams who declared, "America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." He believed in restraint, in moral leadership, in expanding liberty without sacrificing principle. The 1824 election, a controversial victory. In 1824, Adams ran for president, but this was no ordinary election, for candidates split the vote. Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and Henry Clay all vied for the top. Jackson won the popular vote, but not a majority in the Electoral College. The decision went to the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay threw his support behind Adams. Soon after, Adams appointed Clay Secretary of State, and Jackson's supporters cried foul. They called it a corrupt bargain. Though legal, the deal haunted Adams's presidency, casting a shadow he could never escape. President 1825 to 1829, a visionary without power. John Quincy Adams entered the White House with grand ambitions. He wanted to create a national university, promote scientific exploration, fund roads, canals, and national infrastructure. He saw government not just as a protector, but as a builder. But Congress, divided and suspicious, blocked many of his plans. His speeches were brilliant, but his demeanor was cold, reserved. He was a man of intellect, in an era shifting toward emotion and populism. In 1828, Jackson ran again. and this time he crushed Adams in a brutal campaign. Adams quietly left office and returned home to Massachusetts, but his story was far from over. The only former president to return to Congress in 1830, Adams was elected to the House of Representatives. He would serve there for 17 more years, becoming one of the fiercest defenders of liberty and the Union. He was nicknamed Old Man Eloquent for his fiery speeches and his sharp mind, which never dulled his most passionate cause, abolition. He fought tirelessly against slavery, introducing petitions, battling the gag rule that tried to silence debate. Though old and often alone in his views, he stood his ground. He believed the Union must be preserved, but not at the cost of human dignity. Amistad and the Supreme Court in 1841. Adams argued one final case before the Supreme Court. It involved the Amistad, a Spanish slave ship taken over by enslaved Africans. Adams, at age 73, defended the men, arguing for their freedom before the highest court. He spoke for over 8 hours, without notes, and he won. It was a triumph of law, of principle, of humanity. A quiet passing on February 21st, 1848, while speaking on the floor of the House. John Quincy Adams collapsed. He died 2 days later in the Capitol building, whispering, "This is the last of earth. I am content." He was 80 years old. Closing reflections, the legacy of John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams never chased popularity, never pandered, never flinched. He believed in the power of thought, the duty of truth, and the purpose of public service. He is remembered not for a successful presidency, but for a lifetime of service as diplomat, as congressman, as moral compass. He warned of the dangers of slavery, defended the voiceless, and stood tall even in solitude. Thank you for taking this quiet moment to reflect with me on the life of John Quincy Adams. Next time we enter a storm of populism, dueling pistols, and a presidency unlike any before. Join me as we uncover the legendary life of Andrew Jackson. Until then, sleep well and dream gently of justice. Episode 7. Andrew Jackson, the People's President. Now we turn to a figure larger than life, a warrior, a populist, a president loved by many and feared by many more, a man of contradictions, of thunderous will and fierce conviction. This is the story of Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, and one of the most polarizing figures in American history. Let's begin. Frontier beginnings. Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767, in the Waxhaws, a border region between North and South Carolina. His birth was humble. His parents were poor Scotch-Irish immigrants. His father died before he was born. As a boy, Jackson was swept into the chaos of the Revolutionary War. At just 13, he served as a courier for the militia. Captured by the British, he refused to clean a British officer's boots and received a saber cut across the face for his defiance. He lost his mother and 2 brothers in the war. By the age of 14, he was an orphan, alone in a young, war-torn country. These years hardened him and defined the relentless spirit that would follow him for life. Law, dueling, and the rise of a fighter. Jackson became a lawyer, then a land speculator, then a judge, but it was his temper, his honor, and his fist that often led the way. He fought duels, many of them, including one where he killed a man named Charles Dickinson after being shot in the chest himself. Jackson never forgot a slight, and never forgave a betrayal. His fierce personality drew both fear and loyalty. Military fame, the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson became a national hero during the War of 1812. In 1815, he led a ragtag force to victory at the Battle of New Orleans against a seasoned British army. The battle occurred after the peace treaty had been signed, but the American public didn't know that. Yet, to them, Jackson was a savior, the man who defended the homeland. He was nicknamed Old Hickory, tough as wood, unbending, unbreakable. He would go on to command military campaigns in Florida, including controversial raids against native tribes and Spanish forts. His military exploits were often brutal, but undeniably effective. The 1824 election, a frustrated victory. Jackson ran for president in 1824. He won the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but not a majority. The House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams instead. When Adams then appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State, Jackson's supporters called it a corrupt bargain. Jackson was furious, and he vowed to return. President 1829 to 1837. A new kind of leader. In 1828, Jackson ran again. This time he won by a landslide. He entered office as the first true people's president, a champion of the common man, opposed to entrenched elites. He held large parties at the White House, open to the public. He distrusted institutions like the National Bank and used his veto power more than all previous presidents combined. Jackson believed in a strong presidency, and in using power decisively. Controversies and power struggles. Jackson's presidency was full of conflict. He vetoed the renewal of the Second Bank of the United States, calling it a tool of the wealthy elite. He faced down South Carolina's attempt to nullify federal tariffs, threatening to use military force to preserve the Union. He survived the first presidential assassination attempt and confronted his attacker personally. His methods were often direct, his language blunt. To his supporters, he was a hero. To his critics, he was authoritarian. The Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, the darkest legacy of Jackson's presidency, was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Jackson argued it was for the protection of native tribes, but in practice it led to forced displacement, suffering, and death. Entire communities were uprooted, including the Cherokee Nation, who were marched west on what became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands perished along the way. Jackson believed he was securing the frontier, but his actions inflicted generational trauma. This chapter remains a heavy shadow, one that cannot be ignored. Final years and legacy. Jackson retired to his plantation, the Hermitage in Tennessee. He remained influential in politics, advising allies and shaping the Democratic Party he helped found. He died on June 8, 1845. At the age of 78, reflection, a complicated legacy. Andrew Jackson was not a quiet man, nor was he a gentle one. He redefined the presidency, expanded executive power, and connected deeply with ordinary Americans. But his legacy is complex, marked by democracy for some and destruction for others. He left behind a stronger union, a more forceful presidency, and a country forever changed. Thank you for joining me on this quiet reflection of a loud life. Next time, we turn to a man who inherited Jackson's battles and faced a nation on the verge of change. Join me as we meet Martin Van Buren, the strategist, the organizer, and the little magician of American politics. Until then, sleep well, and may history whisper gently. Episode 8. Martin Van Buren, the little magician. Next, we meet a man of careful words, precise planning, and quiet cunning, a master of political machinery, the architect of a new kind of party system, and a president shaped by the turbulence of the Jacksonian age. This is the life of Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, and one of the earliest political strategists in American history. Let us begin. Kinderhook beginnings. Martin Van Buren was born on December 5th, 1782, in Kinderhook, New York, to a Dutch-American family. He grew up speaking Dutch as his first language, making him the only U.S. president for whom English was not native. His father was a tavern keeper, and young Martin listened closely to the debates of local farmers, lawyers, and traveling merchants. From these humble beginnings, he absorbed the rhythm of politics, the importance of alliances, and the art of persuasion. He studied law, read voraciously, and entered politics in his 20s. The rise of the little magician Van Buren quickly made a name for himself, not with fiery speeches, but with quiet strategy. He was called the little magician for his ability to work behind the scenes, crafting coalitions, balancing factions, and maneuvering through conflict. He helped build the Albany Regency, a powerful political machine. In New York, he believed parties were not a threat to democracy, but essential to it, a way to channel differing opinions peacefully. This belief would shape his life's work. Senator and ally of Jackson in the 1820s, Van Buren became a U.S. Senator. Though small in stature and soft in speech, he was a force in organization. When Andrew Jackson rose to national prominence, Van Buren saw potential. He became Jackson's political lieutenant, helping unify factions under the banner of the Democratic Party. He served as governor of New York briefly, then as Secretary of State under Jackson, and later as Vice President, when Jackson chose not to run for a third term. Van Buren was the natural successor. He was elected president in 1836, president 1837 to 1841, a nation in panic. Van Buren entered office at a time of prosperity, but almost immediately the economy collapsed. The panic of 1837 struck hard. Banks failed, businesses shuttered, unemployment soared. Van Buren, a firm believer in limited government, chose not to intervene aggressively. He opposed creating a new national bank and instead proposed the independent treasury system, which separated government funds from private banks. His calm demeanor and deliberate policies were no match for the public's anger. His opponents labeled him Martin Van Ruin. Though his response was consistent with his values, it cost him dearly in popularity. Slavery, Texas, and the expansion question. Van Buren was cautious on the issue of slavery. Too cautious, some would say. he opposed the immediate annexation of Texas, fearing it would inflame tensions between North and South. Though a supporter of Southern rights, he also sought to prevent the spread of slavery. It was a careful balancing act, one that would not hold much longer. The election of 1840, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. By 1840, Van Buren faced a wave of discontent. The Whig Party nominated William Henry Harrison, a war hero with a catchy slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. The campaign was lively, theatrical, and populist. Despite Van Buren's sharp mind and experience, he seemed out of touch. He lost the election and quietly stepped away from the presidency. Later years a return to principle. But Van Buren did not disappear in 1848. He ran for president again, this time under the banner of the Free Soil Party, opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories that he would rather lose on principle than win by compromise. And he did lose, but he made his stand, final years and quiet departure. Martin Van Buren spent his final years at his estate, Lindenwold, in Kinderhook. He watched the country slide further toward division, watched the Democratic Party fracture. He died on July 24, 1862, during the height of the Civil War, a conflict he had tried to prevent with caution, but that now roared through the land he once led. Reflection, a mind of strategy, a life of balance. Martin Van Buren was not a president of thunder. He did not roar, he calculated, listened, and moved carefully. He built the modern political party, believed in institutional stability, and never betrayed his sense of order. To some he lacked vision, to others he was the quiet guardian of a turbulent republic. In the grand mosaic of American history, he was not the loudest brushstroke, but an essential one. Thank you for taking this moment to reflect quietly on the life of Martin Van Buren. Next time, we enter a brief, tragic chapter. A president who spoke little, served briefly, and left quietly. Join me as we meet William Henry Harrison and uncover the shortest presidency in American history. Until then, sleep peacefully, and let the past hold you gently. Episode 9. William Henry Harrison, the shortest presidency. Tonight, we tell the story of a man who rose to power with great expectations, but whose time in office was as brief as a gust of wind, gone before it could be fully understood. This is the life of William Henry Harrison, the 9th President of the United States, whose presidency is remembered more for its brevity than for any major accomplishments. Let us begin. Early life. A soldier's son, William Henry Harrison, was born on February 9, 1773, in Berkeley Plantation, Virginia. His father, Benjamin Harrison, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but young William would have to carve his own path. Harrison was raised in a world of privilege, but also one of military service. He joined the military at a young age, fighting in the Northwest Indian War, and later in the War of 1812, his victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 earned him national fame, making him a hero in the eyes of the American public. He was known as Old Tippecanoe, a symbol of the frontier spirit and a man of action. The road to the presidency. After his military service, Harrison moved into politics. He served as governor of the Indiana Territory, and later as U.S. Senator and ambassador to Colombia. His political career was marked by his affiliation with the Whig Party, a party formed in opposition to President Andrew Jackson and his policies. Harrison's reputation as a war hero made him a popular figure, and in 1840 he ran for president. The campaign was filled with catchy slogans and populist appeal. Harrison was portrayed as a man of the people, a man who could lead the country with vigor and strength. The election of 1840, a victory for the people. The campaign of 1840 was unlike any before it. Harrison was depicted as a humble man of simple tastes, drinking cider by the fire, rather than the image of a distant aristocrat. The slogan Tippecanoe and Tyler too became a rallying cry, and Harrison defeated Martin Van Buren in a landslide. He was inaugurated as the 9th president on March 4, 1841. At the age of 68, the oldest man to become president at that time, the presidency, a flash of history, but in those early days, the nation did not have the chance to fully see what Harrison would bring to the presidency. On March 4, 1841, Harrison gave an inaugural address that lasted for nearly 2 hours. He spoke without a coat, braving the cold wind, eager to show strength and vitality. But the cold was too much. Just days after the inauguration, Harrison fell ill. He was diagnosed with pneumonia, and within 31 days he passed away on April 4, 1841. The legacy of Harrison's presidency, William Henry Harrison's presidency, remains by far the shortest in American history. In just 1 month, his time in office was cut tragically short, though he did not have time to enact significant policies. His death led to an important constitutional question. Vice President John Tyler, upon Harrison's death, assumed the presidency, establishing the precedent for the presidential succession. This moment would later become a defining feature of American government and is a key part of Harrison's legacy, though it was not his intention. Reflection: a life interrupted. William Henry Harrison's life was one of service. He dedicated himself to his country, as a soldier, as a diplomat, and as a politician. He entered the White House with the hope of leading a nation forward, but his journey was not meant to last. His death was a reminder of the fleeting nature of life, of how quickly things can change, and how, sometimes, history takes an unexpected turn. Though his presidency was brief, his role in American politics was significant. He represented the frontier spirit, the drive for independence, and the hope for a new kind of leadership. Closing quietly, moving forward, thank you for joining me tonight in reflecting on the life of William Henry Harrison. Next time, we turn to the man who succeeded him, a president who navigated the early storms of American politics and shaped the role of the vice president in profound ways. Join me as we meet John Tyler and discover the decisions he made in the wake of Harrison's sudden passing. Until then, rest well and let the winds of history carry you gently to sleep. Episode 10. John Tyler, the Accidental President and Knight. We reflect on the life of John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, a man who never expected to be president at all. Tyler's story is one of unexpected turns, of a nation in transition, and of a man who, in the face of great uncertainty, had to redefine the role of the presidency itself. Let's begin. Early life. A Southern aristocrat, John Tyler was born on March 29, 1790, in Charles City County, Virginia, to a well-established, wealthy family. His father, John Tyler Sr., was a prominent landowner and politician. Young John was well educated. With a sharp mind and a love for learning, he graduated from College of William and Mary at the age of 17, and quickly entered the legal profession. Tyler's early life was shaped by Virginia's aristocratic society, but he felt drawn to public service and soon began his early political career, a defender of states' rights in his 20s. Tyler entered the world of politics, serving in the Virginia House of Delegates. He quickly gained a reputation as a staunch states' rights advocate. Tyler was a member of the Democratic-Republican Party, a party that was deeply skeptical of centralized power. He opposed what he saw as the growing influence of the federal government. His views aligned with those of Thomas Jefferson, and he became a loyal supporter of the Jeffersonians' ideals of limited government. Governor of Virginia, a voice for states' rights. Tyler's political career took him to the governor's mansion in Virginia, where he served as governor of Virginia from 1825 to 1827. His time as governor was relatively quiet, but it solidified his position as a defender of states' rights. After his governorship, Tyler returned to the U.S. House of Representatives, and later served in the U.S. Senate. But during this time, he found himself increasingly at odds with the Democratic Party. His support for states' rights and opposition to the national bank made him a rising figure among the more conservative factions of American politics. The vice presidency, the accidental promotion in 1840, Tyler was chosen as the vice presidential candidate on the Whig Party ticket, running alongside William Henry Harrison. The Whig Party was a coalition of various groups, including former Jacksonian Democrats like Tyler, who were disillusioned with President Andrew Jackson's policies. Tyler was selected as a compromise candidate meant to appeal to the southern states and balance the ticket with Harrison. A war hero from the North, Tyler was a relatively minor figure in the campaign, his name chosen primarily for political convenience. He never anticipated actually becoming president, but fate had other plans. The tragedy: Harrison's sudden death on March 4, 1841. William Henry Harrison was inaugurated as the 9th President of the United States. However, just 31 days later, Harrison passed away from pneumonia. This left John Tyler in an unexpected position. He became the first vice president to ascend to the presidency. Due to the death of a sitting president, it was a moment of great uncertainty. At the time, there was no clear guidance in the Constitution on whether Tyler should simply serve as an acting president, or if he should take the office in full. Tyler made it clear from the outset, he was not an acting president. He was the President of the United States, with all the powers and responsibilities that came with the title. The early days establishing authority: when Tyler took office, he faced strong opposition. Many Whigs did not see him as their true leader, and some even considered him a Democrat in Whig's clothing. He inherited a nation in political turmoil, and many questioned whether he could navigate the challenges ahead. Tyler, however, proved to be decisive. He refused to compromise on his views of states' rights and limited government, presidency policies and struggles. One of Tyler's first actions was to veto a bill for the re-establishment of the National Bank, a major issue for the Whig Party. This veto led to a bitter break with the Whig leadership. Despite his party affiliation, Tyler governed with a democratic spirit, and many of his policies aligned more closely with the views of Andrew Jackson than with the Whigs. His presidency also saw the annexation of Texas. After a long and difficult debate, Tyler managed to push the annexation of Texas through Congress in 1845, a move that dramatically expanded the United States. The break with the Whigs, Tyler's isolation. Despite his successes, Tyler's presidency was marred by political isolation. His vetoes angered the Whig Party leadership, and his refusal to adhere to their demands for a strong central government alienated his supporters by the end of his presidency. Tyler was effectively kicked out of the Whig Party. The legacy of John Tyler. Tyler left office in 1845, with his presidency marked by both accomplishments and controversy. He was the first president to ascend to office due to the death of a predecessor, setting a precedent that would remain in place for future generations. Tyler's legacy is complex. He is remembered for his firm belief in states' rights, his push for the annexation of Texas, and his isolation from the political establishment. Final years returned to Virginia after leaving the presidency. Tyler retired to his plantation. In Virginia, where he lived quietly for the rest of his life, in the Civil War years, Tyler's views on states' rights came to the forefront again. He joined the Confederacy in 1861 and even served in the Confederate Congress. He died on January 18, 1862, at the age of 71. Reflection: a complex legacy. John Tyler was not a president who sought the spotlight. He was a man of deep conviction, who found himself in the highest office in the land, not by ambition, but by accident. His presidency challenged political norms, and in many ways set the stage for future presidential succession. But his legacy is clouded by his party conflict and his support for slavery. Still, Tyler's role in shaping the office of the president cannot be ignored. He proved that a president, no matter how unexpected, can still leave a mark on history. Closing quietly, reflecting. Thank you for joining me this evening in reflecting on the life of John Tyler. Next time, we will meet a man who followed Tyler and navigated the expansionist dreams of a growing nation. Join me as we explore the life and presidency of James K. Polk. Until then, rest deeply and let the gentle winds of history carry you softly into sleep. Episode 11. James K. Polk. Expansion and Ambition. Tonight, we delve into the life of James K. Polk, the 11th President of the United States, a man of determination, a president with a vision to expand the nation, and a leader who achieved everything he set out to do. In just one single term, let us begin the story of this ambitious man, whose presidency reshaped the very boundaries of the United States. Early life: the son of a pioneer, James Knox Polk, was born on November 2, 1795, in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. His family were pioneers settling in the new frontiers of the American South. His early life was not easy. He was a sickly child, suffering from various health issues, but he overcame his challenges with a strong will and a sharp mind. Polk attended UNC Chapel Hill, graduating at the age of 20, and he went on to study law. He became a successful lawyer, but it was his interest in politics that truly defined his path. Entering politics, a rising star, Polk's political career began when he was elected to the Tennessee state legislature in 1823. By the age of 29, he was serving in Congress, where he quickly gained a reputation as a hard-working and principled leader. Polk was a strong supporter of Andrew Jackson and his policies, aligning himself with Jacksonian ideals and supporting the Democratic Party. As it grew under Jackson's influence, in 1825, Polk was appointed governor of Tennessee. Though his time in the governor's mansion was marked by challenges, he demonstrated ambition and a growing national presence. The presidency, a focused vision, in 1844, Polk ran for the presidency. His campaign was built around a clear vision: to expand the United States and to fulfill the so-called Manifest Destiny. Polk promised to annex Texas, to acquire the Oregon Territory, and to bring California into the Union. He ran on the slogan, 54-40 or fight, a reference to the northern boundary of Oregon, where Polk demanded American control. He won the election in a narrow but decisive victory over Henry Clay, a Whig candidate who was more cautious on expansion. Polk's victory marked a turning point for the nation, as the country embraced an era of aggressive territorial expansion. The Mexican-American War, the price of expansion. One of Polk's first major challenges was the issue of Texas. The Republic of Texas had declared its independence from Mexico in 1836, and after years of uncertainty, Polk successfully pushed for its annexation in 1845. But this move angered Mexico, and in 1846, the U.S. and Mexico went to war over the borders of Texas. And the broader issue of expansion into the Southwest, the Mexican-American War, raged from 1846 to 1848, a conflict that Polk believed was necessary to fulfill America's manifest destiny. Polk was often criticized for provoking the war, but he remained determined. His vision of a larger, more powerful nation was worth the cost. Victory and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo under Polk's leadership, the United States emerged victorious. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, ending the war and securing vast new territories for the United States. The Mexican cession included the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. With the treaty, Polk achieved the core of his vision. The United States had expanded westward, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Oregon Territory diplomacy at work. In addition to the Mexican-American War, Polk also negotiated a peaceful resolution with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory. Through diplomatic negotiations, Polk successfully secured the land below the 49th parallel, avoiding war with Britain and acquiring what is now Oregon, Washington, and parts of Idaho. His ability to balance diplomacy with military action made him a skilled and focused leader. Polk's domestic policies, achieving goals often unpopular. Polk's presidency was marked by his relentless pursuit of his goals. In addition to territorial expansion, he sought to reform the nation's financial system. He was a strong proponent of lower tariffs and pushed through the Walker Tariff of 1846, which reduced the tariff rates and promoted international trade. He also established the independent Treasury system, separating government funds from private banks in an effort to stabilize the economy. However, his domestic policies were often contentious, and his aggressive approach alienated some, especially within his own party. One term, one vision, Polk made it clear early in his presidency that he would serve only one term. He was focused on accomplishing his goals, and once they were achieved, he intended to step away by 1848. Polk had achieved virtually everything he set out to do. The annexation of Texas, the resolution of the Oregon dispute, and the expansion of the U.S. to the Pacific. His health, however, had begun to suffer. The intense pressure of his presidency took its toll, and Polk was a tired man by the end of his term. Legacy, a man of accomplishment, but a divisive vision. Polk left office in 1849 and retired to his home in Nashville, Tennessee. Sadly, his health quickly deteriorated, and he died on June 15, 1849, just 3 months after leaving office. At the age of 53, Polk's presidency remains one of ambition and success, but also one of controversy. His aggressive pursuit of expansion, especially through war, left deep scars on the nation. The Mexican-American War fueled tensions over slavery, and the new territories added fuel to the fire that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Still, Polk's achievements cannot be denied. He shaped the United States into a continental power, and his vision of manifest destiny became a driving force in American politics. Reflection, a legacy of ambition. James K. Polk was a president of vision, a man who sought to expand the boundaries of the United States and who achieved nearly everything he set out to do. But his legacy is complicated. The expansion he sought, while securing a vast new territory for the United States, also deepened the divisions that would tear the country apart in the years to come. Thank you for joining me tonight as we reflect on the life and presidency of James K. Polk. Next time, we turn to the man who succeeded him, a president who faced the painful consequences of expansion. Join me as we explore the life of Zachary Taylor. Until then, rest well, and let the calm winds of history carry you gently into sleep. Episode 12. Zachary Taylor, the Soldier President. Tonight, we take a quiet look at the life of Zachary Taylor, the 12th President of the United States, a man whose life was defined by war, and whose time in the White House was tragically short. Taylor was not a career politician, but a soldier, a leader whose experience on the battlefield led him to the highest office in the land. Let us begin the story of this soldier president. Early life, born to a family of wealth and promise. Zachary Taylor was born on November 24, 1784, in Orange County, Virginia, to a prominent family of planters. His father, Richard Taylor, was a wealthy landowner and a veteran of the Revolutionary War. Growing up on the family's plantation, Zachary was not particularly fond of school, but he was drawn to the life of the military. In 1808, at the age of 23, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. This began a lifelong career that would take him from the frontier to the battlefields of the nation's wars. Military career from frontier to war hero. Taylor's early military career took him to the frontiers of the American colonies, where he was stationed in Louisiana and later in the Mississippi Territory. His work was largely on the frontier, where he faced the challenges of Native American resistance and the expansion of the United States. However, it was during the Mexican-American War that Taylor truly made his name. In 1846, when war broke out between the United States and Mexico, Taylor was called into action as a commander. he led his forces to a series of decisive victories, including the famous Battle of Buena Vista in 1847, where he successfully defended against a much larger Mexican force. His victory in this battle earned him national fame. He became a war hero, and his reputation as a leader of men spread far and wide. The rise to the presidency, a man of the people, after his success in the Mexican-American War, Taylor became a popular figure, and in 1848 the Whig Party selected him as their candidate for president, despite having no political experience. Taylor was seen as a symbol of strength, a man who had led troops to victory and understood the struggles of ordinary Americans. His simple, straightforward approach to leadership resonated with the public. He campaigned on the promise of honesty, integrity, and a commitment to the Union. He won the election against Lewis Cass, the Democratic candidate, and on March 4, 1849, Taylor was inaugurated as the 12th President of the United States. The presidency, a short and uneventful term, Zachary Taylor's presidency was brief, just 16 months long. However, during that short time, he faced significant challenges. One of the most pressing issues was the debate over slavery in the newly acquired territories following the Mexican-American War. Though Taylor was a slave owner himself, he was not an advocate of the expansion of slavery into the new territories. His views on slavery were moderate compared to many of his contemporaries, and he wanted to avoid conflict between the North and South. Unfortunately, his attempts to balance the interests of both sides were not enough to prevent the growing tensions that would later lead to the Civil War. One of Taylor's most important actions as president was to push for California and New Mexico to be admitted as free states, a stance that angered many Southern politicians who wanted the expansion of slavery. The sudden end, a president's death. Tragically, President Taylor's time in office was cut short. On July 4, 1850, just over a year into his presidency, Taylor attended Independence Day celebrations in Washington, D.C. It was a hot summer day, and Taylor, determined to be part of the festivities, drank cold milk and ate cherries. Later that night, he fell ill. He was struck by severe stomach pains, and within days he developed cholera. On July 9, 1850, Zachary Taylor passed away at the age of 65. The nation was stunned by his sudden death. The presidency passed to his vice president, Millard, but Taylor's untimely demise left the country in a state of uncertainty. Legacy: a soldier, not a politician. Though Taylor's presidency was short, he remains an important figure in American history. He was a man of the people, a leader who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most famous military commanders in U.S. history. His presidency, marked by his efforts to maintain peace between the North and South, is often remembered for its moderation in the face of growing sectional tensions. But it is also remembered for the uncertainty that followed his death. As the nation continued to grapple with the issue of slavery, Zachary Taylor was not a politician, but a soldier through and through, a man who did his best to serve his country, but whose time in office was cut tragically short. Reflection: a soldier's duty. Zachary Taylor's life reminds us of the honor of service, of a man who fought for his country and led in times of war, only to find himself leading in times of peace. Though his presidency was brief, he left an enduring legacy as a soldier and a president, a figure who embodies the idea of duty above all else. Thank you for joining me tonight, as we remember Zachary Taylor, the soldier-president. Next time, we will meet the man who succeeded him, a president who faced the delicate challenge of navigating a nation in turmoil. Join me as we explore the life of Millard Fillmore. Until then, rest well, and let the quiet whispers of history guide you gently into sleep. Episode 13. Millard Fillmore, a president in the shadows. Tonight, we look at the life of Millard Fillmore, the 13th President of the United States, a man who rose to the highest office in the land, not by election, but by the death of his predecessor, Zachary Taylor, a man who was often overshadowed by the giants of his era, yet whose presidency faced one of the most critical moments in American history, the Compromise of 1850. Let us now explore the life and legacy of Millard Fillmore, a president who served in the shadows of greater figures. Early life. From humble beginnings, Millard Fillmore was born on January 7, 1800, in Cayuga County, New York, to a poor family in a log cabin. His father, Nathaniel Fillmore, was a farmer, and Millard grew up in poverty. Education was scarce, but Millard's thirst for knowledge was strong. He worked as an apprentice to a clothmaker and then a schoolteacher before studying law on his own. His dedication to self-improvement paid off when he passed the bar exam. In 1823, he became a successful lawyer and entered the world of politics. He served in the New York State Assembly in 1829 and was later elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1833, where he would begin his long career in public service. Political career, a moderate and practical mind, Fillmore was a member of the Whig Party, and throughout his career he was known as a moderate and pragmatic politician. He did not align himself strictly with either the North or the South, but rather sought to find common ground in a nation growing increasingly divided over the issue of slavery. He was known for his strong work ethic and for being a man of principle. Though he was not a prominent figure during his early years in Congress, his rise within the Whig Party was steady and deliberate. By 1848, he was serving as vice president under President Zachary Taylor. The presidency, a shift in leadership. In July 1850, President Zachary Taylor passed away suddenly from illness, leaving Millard Fillmore to take office as the 13th President of the United States. At first, Fillmore was an unlikely leader. He was not a man with grand ambitions for the presidency, and he had not campaigned for the office yet. He inherited a nation on the brink of division, one where the issue of slavery and the expansion of territories was tearing at the fabric of American society. The Compromise of 1850, a defining moment. One of Fillmore's most significant challenges as president was the issue of slavery in the newly acquired territories from the Mexican-American War. The debate over the extension of slavery into the territories had created growing tensions between the North and South. In 1850, Fillmore found himself in the midst of a political crisis. A series of bills, collectively known as the Compromise of 1850, were introduced to address the issue. The Compromise, championed by Henry Clay, sought to find a balance between the demands of both regions. California would be admitted as a free state, the Fugitive Slave Act would be strengthened, and the status of slavery in other territories would be determined by popular sovereignty. Though the compromise was highly controversial, Fillmore supported it, believing it was the best way to preserve the Union and avoid a civil war. In his first annual message to Congress, he urged lawmakers to support the compromise, and his backing helped ensure its passage. The Fugitive Slave Act, however, was one of the most contentious elements of the compromise. It required citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves and penalized those who aided in their escape. This part of the compromise angered many in the North and further deepened the divide between the two regions. Challenges and controversies. A presidency of struggle, though Fillmore believed the compromise was necessary to save the Union. His presidency was marked by growing sectionalism and discontent. The Whig Party was already fractured, and Fillmore's moderate stance on slavery alienated many in both the North and the South. He struggled to find support from either side, and his presidency was often seen as one of ineffectiveness by contemporaries. In foreign affairs, Fillmore did manage to make a significant diplomatic achievement. In 1853, he sent Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan to open the country to American trade, an effort that eventually led to the signing of the Treaty of Kanagawa. In 1854, yet domestically, Fillmore's presidency struggled. His support for the Compromise of 1850 left him unpopular in the North, and his attempts to placate the South did not prevent the growing tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The end of Fillmore's presidency, the fall of the Whig Party. Fillmore's time in office was marked by political uncertainty. In 1852, he did not receive the Whig Party's nomination for a second term. Instead, the party chose Winfield Scott, who, like Fillmore, was also unable to win the presidency. In the years after his presidency, the Whig Party disintegrated, and Fillmore faded from national prominence. Though he remained active in public life, he never regained the political influence he had once held. Legacy: a president in the shadows today. Millard Fillmore is often regarded as a forgotten president, a leader who did not leave a lasting mark on the nation. He served in a time of deep division, yet his attempts to mediate those divisions did not succeed in preventing the inevitable conflict. His legacy is complicated. On one hand, he was a pragmatic politician who sought to preserve the Union, but on the other, his policies, particularly the Fugitive Slave Act, have been criticized for exacerbating the tensions that led to the Civil War. Millard Fillmore's presidency was one of quiet struggle. A man caught between two powerful forces, the desire to maintain peace and the growing call for abolition. Though he may not have achieved great renown, he played a role in a pivotal moment in American history. His legacy may not be loud, but it is part of the complex story of a nation on the brink of change. Reflection: a quiet presidency. As we reflect on Millard Fillmore, we see a president who was thrust into office by circumstance, and whose presidency was shaped by the pressing challenges of his time, in a nation divided by issues of slavery and states' rights. He did his best to navigate the storm, but in the end, the compromises he made did not prevent the coming conflict. Thank you for joining me tonight, as we remember Millard Fillmore, a president in the shadows. Next time, we turn to the life of the man who followed him, a president whose legacy was shaped by the conflict that Fillmore tried to avert. Join me as we explore the life of Franklin Pierce. Until then, rest well, and let the gentle currents of history carry you into peaceful dreams. Episode 14. Franklin Pierce, The Troubled President Tonight, we explore the presidency of Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States. Pierce's time in office was marked by deep division and tension. A nation on the brink of civil war, he was a president who inherited a country in crisis, but struggled to find a way to bridge the growing rift between the North and South. Let us begin this quiet reflection on a presidency, and a man whose best intentions were caught in the storm of his time. Early life, a politician from New Hampshire, Franklin Pierce was born on November 23, 1804, in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. His father, Benjamin Pierce, was a former soldier in the Revolutionary War and a prominent politician in New Hampshire. Growing up, Franklin Pierce was surrounded by politics, and his early life was influenced by his father's career. Pierce attended Bowdoin College in Maine, where he was known for his quiet demeanor and strong intellect. After graduating in 1824, he studied law and eventually established his practice in Concord, New Hampshire. In 1829. At the age of 24, Pierce married Jane Means Appleton, a deeply religious woman who was known for her gentle nature. The couple would have 3 children, but tragically, they lost all of them to illness at young ages, a heart-wrenching sorrow that would weigh heavily on Pierce throughout his life. Political rise, a career in the House and Senate. Pierce's political career began when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1833. He served for several terms, gaining a reputation as a strong supporter of states' rights and democratic principles. In the 1830s, Pierce also served in the U.S. Senate, where his stance on slavery was largely moderate. He was a Democrat, but not a radical on either side of the slavery debate. Rather, he sought to maintain peace, believing that the Union should be preserved above all else. However, his time in the Senate was cut short in 1842 when he resigned due to a lack of political support back home. The presidential election of 1852, the dark horse candidate in 1852, as the country was embroiled in the debate over slavery and expansion, Franklin Pierce emerged as a compromise candidate for the Democratic Party. The Democrats were divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, and at their convention no candidate seemed able to unite them in a surprising turn of events. The delegates selected Pierce as their nominee, a man who had relatively little national recognition, but who was considered a safe, middle-ground choice. The Whig Party, fractured by its internal divisions, nominated Winfield Scott. Pierce easily defeated Scott in the election, becoming the 14th President of the United States, and taking office on March 4, 1853. The presidency struggles with sectional tensions. Pierce's presidency began with a sense of optimism, but it quickly became apparent that the nation was in turmoil. The issue of slavery was tearing the country apart, and Pierce's efforts to maintain a delicate balance between the North and South ultimately failed. One of his first challenges came with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, a law that allowed settlers in the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. The law effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had previously established a boundary between free and slave territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act caused an uproar, leading to violent clashes in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. These confrontations became known as Bleeding Kansas, a horrifying precursor to the violence that would eventually erupt in the Civil War. Despite Pierce's belief that the act would calm tensions, it only deepened the divide between the North and South, and many Northerners saw Pierce as a president who had sold out to the South. The troubles with the South and his support for the Fugitive Slave Act, in addition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Pierce's presidency was marked by his staunch support for the Fugitive Slave Act. This law, part of the Compromise of 1850, required the return of runaway slaves to their owners, even if they had escaped to free states. The Fugitive Slave Act angered many in the North, where abolitionist sentiment was growing stronger. Many northern states passed personal liberty laws to resist the act, and Pierce's enforcement of the law alienated many in his own party. In the South, however, Pierce was seen as a hero for upholding the institution of slavery. Personal tragedy, the loss of his son amidst the turmoil of his presidency. Pierce faced the profound grief of losing his only surviving child, Benny, who was killed in a tragic train accident just days before his inauguration. The death of Benny at the age of 11 devastated Pierce and his wife, Jane. The tragedy affected Pierce deeply, and he was never able to fully recover from the loss. It is said that Pierce's personal grief contributed to his inability to effectively lead during a time of national crisis, and his emotional distress may have clouded his judgment during critical moments. The end of his presidency, a weakened leader as his term in office continued. Pierce became increasingly isolated and unpopular. The sectional crisis deepened, and the nation continued to drift toward civil war. In 1856, the Democratic Party chose James Buchanan as its nominee for president, and Pierce was not even considered as a contender for re-election. Pierce left office in 1857 with little fanfare. His presidency, marked by his failed attempts at compromise, is often remembered as one of the most ineffective and troubled in U.S. history. Legacy: a man torn by his time, Franklin Pierce's presidency is one of the most tragic and troubled. In American history, a man of deep conviction, he sought to preserve the Union and maintain peace. But his efforts only exacerbated the divisions that would lead to the Civil War. Though he was deeply loved by some in the South, he is remembered by many in the North as a weak and divisive leader. His personal tragedy, the loss of his son, left him emotionally shattered, and his presidency is often seen as one that could not navigate the turbulent waters of his time. Franklin Pierce died on October 8, 1869, at the age of 64, living much of his later life in obscurity. Reflection: the weight of leadership in a time of crisis. Franklin Pierce's presidency serves as a reminder of the heavy burden of leadership during times of great national distress. He was a man who sought peace but was unable to prevent the storm that was coming. A president who tried to heal wounds but instead deepened them. A man whose best intentions were swept away by the tides of history. Thank you for joining me tonight as we reflect on the presidency of Franklin Pierce. Next time we turn to James Buchanan, a man who would face the final days of the Union before it fractured beyond repair. Until then, let the quiet whispers of history guide you through the night. Episode 15. James Buchanan, the president who couldn't stop the storm tonight. We turn to James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States. A man who found himself in the highest office during the darkest days of the Union, a time when the divisions over slavery and states' rights seemed irreconcilable. a man whose failure to act decisively at a time of crisis would have lasting consequences for the nation. Let us reflect on his presidency, and the storm that he could not stop early life. A son of Pennsylvania, James Buchanan was born on April 23, 1791, in Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, the son of a wealthy farmer, James Buchanan Sr., and Elizabeth Spear Buchanan. From an early age, James was deeply influenced by his family's commitment to education and hard work. He was a dedicated student, and after attending Dickinson College, he studied law and passed the bar exam in 1812. At the age of 21, his legal career took off quickly, and Buchanan soon became a respected lawyer in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But it was his political ambitions that would shape his future. By 1820, he was elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. From there, his career in politics grew, and by the 1830s, he was serving as a U.S. congressman. Political career, a long road to the presidency. Buchanan's political career was long and distinguished, and he served in several key positions. Before reaching the presidency, in 1829, he was appointed as the U.S. Minister to Russia, where he served with great distinction, earning a reputation as a skilled diplomat. After returning to the U.S., Buchanan served as a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, and was later appointed by President James K. Polk as his Secretary of State. Through all of these roles, Buchanan developed a reputation as a man who could maintain political calm. He was viewed as a moderate and diplomatic leader, but when it came to the issue of slavery and the impending storm that was brewing in the South, Buchanan struggled to make clear effective decisions. In 1856, after a bitter and divisive election, Buchanan emerged as the Democratic Party's candidate for president. He was chosen largely because he was seen as a candidate who could appease both the North and the South. The presidency, the strain of sectionalism. James Buchanan took office on March 4, 1857, in the midst of the economic panic of 1857 and the rising tensions between the North and South. At the time, the issue of slavery was consuming the nation. The debate was no longer about the future of slavery in the territories. It was about the very future of the Union itself. Buchanan had long believed that the issue of slavery would eventually fade, and that it was best left to the states to decide. He also believed in a strong union, and that the states should remain united at all costs. But as he assumed the presidency, the nation was rapidly approaching a point of no return. The Dred Scott decision, a moment of crisis, in 1857. Just months after Buchanan's inauguration, the Supreme Court issued its Dred Scott decision, a ruling that would have profound consequences for Buchanan's presidency and the nation. The court ruled that Dred Scott, a slave who had sued for his freedom, had no right to sue in federal court because he was not a citizen. The decision also stated that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional, and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. The ruling was a devastating blow to the hopes of many in the North, and it emboldened the pro-slavery forces in the South. Buchanan, a strong supporter of the Supreme Court, publicly endorsed the decision. But this only further alienated him from Northern Democrats and the growing anti-slavery movement. The Dred Scott decision added fuel to the flames of sectionalism, and Buchanan's endorsement of the ruling deepened the rift between the North and South. The secession crisis, a nation in disarray, As Buchanan's presidency continued, the crisis deepened. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had already sparked violence in Kansas, and now the Dred Scott decision seemed to push the country toward an inevitable breaking point. Southern states began to openly discuss secession, the possibility of leaving the Union. South Carolina, in particular, was vocal in its threats to secede if its interests were not protected. Buchanan, despite being a veteran politician and diplomat, failed to take any meaningful action. His belief in the power of the Constitution and his insistence on preserving the Union led him to adopt a stance of appeasement. He believed that the secession crisis would resolve itself peacefully, but he underestimated the rising tide of anger and distrust between the North and South. His lack of decisive action only led to further instability. In the final months of his presidency, Buchanan was largely powerless to prevent the crisis from spiraling out of control. The end of Buchanan's presidency, a fractured nation, Buchanan left office in 1861, handing over the reins of leadership to Abraham Lincoln, the man who would face the full fury of the Civil War at the time of Buchanan's departure. 7 Southern states had already seceded from the Union, and Buchanan's failure to take action was seen as a tragic and fatal flaw of his presidency. Buchanan's final message was one of regret, but it was too late for reconciliation. The damage had been done. Legacy: a president of inaction today. James Buchanan is often regarded as one of the least effective presidents in American history. His failure to act decisively in the face of the growing crisis over slavery and secession left the nation in a state of profound disarray. While his supporters might argue that he did his best to maintain peace, the reality is that Buchanan's inability to address the root causes of the nation's division made war almost inevitable. He is often criticized for his deep belief in constitutional legality without recognizing the moral and political urgency of the situation. A president caught between his personal beliefs, the pressures of his party, and the rapidly evolving political landscape. James Buchanan's presidency, marked by indecision and missed opportunities, is a somber chapter in the history of the United States. His failure to prevent the storm that would tear the Union apart left him with a legacy of inaction and failure to lead. Reflection: the weight of leadership in a time of crisis. As we reflect on James Buchanan's presidency, we see a man who believed deeply in the principles of the Constitution and the importance of preserving the Union. But sometimes ideals and principles must bend to the realities of the moment. James Buchanan's story is a tragic one. A president who, despite his best intentions, was unable to stop the forces that were pulling the nation toward war. Thank you for joining me tonight as we reflect on the life and presidency of James Buchanan. Next time, we move to Abraham Lincoln, the man who would rise to meet the storm that Buchanan could not quell. Until then, may the gentle winds of history carry you into peaceful dreams. Episode 16, Abraham Lincoln, the Savior of the Union. Tonight, we explore the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, a man whose leadership would come to define the United States in its most turbulent hour. Lincoln rose from humble beginnings, and during a time of division, war, and deep national strife, he became the figure who would lead the nation through its greatest crisis. His presidency would be defined by the Civil War, the fight to preserve the Union, and his unwavering commitment to the ideals of freedom and equality. Let us now take a quiet journey through the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. Early life. A man of humble beginnings, Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. The son of Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks, he grew up in poverty, in a world far removed from the wealth and power of America's elite. As a young boy, Lincoln's family faced constant hardships. They moved often, seeking better opportunities, and young Abe received very little formal education, perhaps just a year or two of schooling in total. But despite these obstacles, Lincoln was a voracious reader, teaching himself whatever he could from the books he could find. Lincoln's early life was one of toil, and by the time he was a teenager, he was already working on the frontier, helping his father with manual labor, farming, and even running a store. It was in these early years that Lincoln developed a deep sense of integrity, a respect for hard work, and a profound empathy for the common people. Political beginnings. A rising star. Lincoln's interest in politics began in his early adulthood. After moving to New Salem, Illinois, Lincoln became involved in the Whig Party, and in 1834 he was elected to the Illinois state legislature. Though he had little formal education, Lincoln's sharp mind, natural eloquence, and rising popularity helped him make a name for himself. In 1836, Lincoln began his law career, studying independently and earning his law license in 1837. He opened a law office in Springfield, Illinois, where he quickly became known as a highly effective and skilled lawyer. Lincoln's political career took another step forward when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846. His term in Washington was relatively uneventful, but he used the position to speak out against the Mexican-American War, which he viewed as unjust and driven by the expansion of slavery. By the 1850s, the issue of slavery had become the central political and moral debate in the United States. Lincoln, having returned to politics after some years away, became a leading voice in the Republican Party, which had emerged as the anti-slavery party in the 1850s. The road to the presidency. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. In 1858, Lincoln gained national attention during his debates with Stephen A. Douglas for the Illinois Senate seat. Though Lincoln lost the election, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were a defining moment in his career. In these debates, Lincoln eloquently argued that slavery should not be allowed to spread into the territories, while Douglas advocated for popular sovereignty, allowing each state to decide for itself. Although Lincoln lost the election, his performance in the debates elevated him to national prominence. By 1860, Lincoln was the Republican nominee for the presidency. The election of 1860, a divided nation. In 1860, the nation was deeply divided. The issue of slavery had split the country into two factions, with the South clinging to the institution of slavery and the North moving toward abolition. Lincoln's election was seen as a direct threat to the Southern way of life. When Lincoln won the presidency with just 40% of the popular vote, the Southern states began to talk of secession from the Union. But Lincoln remained committed to his platform of preserving the Union, even as Southern states began to leave. He believed that the United States was a nation of laws, and that no state had the right to secede. The presidency a nation at war, Lincoln took office on March 4, 1861, at a time when 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union. He inherited a nation on the verge of civil war, and within months of taking office, the war would begin on April 12, 1861. The Confederate States of America fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, officially starting the Civil War. For the next 4 years, Lincoln would lead the Union through one of the darkest periods in American history. He faced overwhelming challenges, military defeats, political divisions, and the moral and practical dilemmas of war. The Emancipation Proclamation, a turning point. One of Lincoln's most defining moments came on January 1st, 1863, when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were to be set free. The proclamation did not immediately free all slaves, but it fundamentally changed the nature of the war. The fight was no longer just about preserving the Union, it was now also about abolishing slavery. This shift in focus garnered support from abolitionists and African Americans, and it made it clear that the future of the nation would not tolerate the institution of slavery. The Battle of Gettysburg. The tide turns. The Battle of Gettysburg. Fought from July 1st to 3rd, 1863, was one of the most significant turning points in the war. It was a decisive victory for the Union, and it marked the beginning of the Confederacy's slow retreat. Lincoln visited the site of the battle on November 19, 1863, to deliver the Gettysburg Address, a brief but powerful speech that reaffirmed the Union's commitment to liberty, equality, and the preservation of the nation. His words echoed throughout history, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. The end of the war and Lincoln's second term. As the war drew to a close, Lincoln was re-elected in 1864, but the country was still ravaged by conflict, and the war was far from over. In the final months of the war, as General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant in April 1865, it seemed that victory was near, but on April 14, 1865, tragedy struck. As Lincoln was attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., he was shot by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Abraham Lincoln died the following day, on April 15, 1865, leaving behind a nation that had been forever changed. Legacy. A nation transformed. Abraham Lincoln's legacy is one of courage, determination, and a deep commitment to the principles of equality and freedom. Through his leadership, he preserved the Union and ended the institution of slavery in the United States. He is often regarded as the greatest president in American history, a man who steered the nation through its darkest hours and emerged as a symbol of hope and reconciliation. Lincoln's life reminds us that the path to freedom and justice is not always clear or easy, but that even in the face of overwhelming odds, true leaders will stand firm for what is right. Thank you for joining me tonight as we reflect on the life and presidency of Abraham Lincoln. Next time, we will turn to the presidency of Andrew Johnson, who would step into Lincoln's shoes at a time when the nation's future was still uncertain. Until then, let the quiet winds of history guide you to peaceful dreams. Episode 17. Andrew Johnson, the President Who Followed Lincoln Tonight. We turn to Andrew Johnson, the 17th President of the United States, who stepped into the highest office at a moment of profound national upheaval following the tragic assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Johnson assumed the presidency at a time when the United States was struggling to heal its wounds from the Civil War. His presidency, marked by controversy, impeachment, and a divided nation, would become a turbulent chapter in the story of the United States. Let us now take a calm, reflective journey through the life and presidency of Andrew Johnson. Early life. A self-made man, Andrew Johnson was born on December 29, 1808, in Raleigh, North Carolina, the son of Jacob Johnson, a poor worker, and Mary McDonough, a humble family in the southern states. His father died when Andrew was just 4 years old, leaving his mother to raise him in poverty. Johnson was denied the privilege of formal schooling, but he developed an interest in reading and learning on his own. By the age of 14, he was apprenticed to a tailor in Lawrence, South Carolina, and from there he would work his way up in the world. Using his determination, ambition, and natural talents, through sheer hard work, Johnson managed to become a successful tailor, and he eventually moved to Greenville, Tennessee, where he would settle and become involved in politics. Political beginnings, a voice for the common man. Andrew Johnson's political career began in the 1830s, when he was elected as an alderman and later as the mayor of Greenville. His rise through local politics was fueled by his populist views. He was a strong advocate for the working class and the poor. In 1843, Johnson was elected to the Tennessee State Legislature, and in 1847 he became the Tennessee governor. He would go on to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1843 to 1853, and as Tennessee's governor again in 1853. Throughout his political career, Johnson was known as a staunch Unionist and Southern Democrat. He was deeply committed to the Union and opposed the secession of Southern states when the Civil War broke out. This stance made him one of the few Southern politicians to remain loyal to the Union during the war, and he earned the respect of many in the North for his firm commitment to preserving the United States. Vice President, the assumption of power in 1864, with the Civil War still raging, President Abraham Lincoln was seeking re-election. To bolster his chances of winning, Lincoln chose Johnson as his running mate for the vice presidency, hoping to appeal to the Southern Unionists who were loyal to the Union but still sympathetic to Southern culture. Johnson was chosen for his strong Unionist stance, despite being a Southern Democrat. When Lincoln won the election, Johnson became the Vice President of the United States, taking office on March 4, 1865. However, just a few weeks later, on April 14, 1865, tragedy struck with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. At the moment of Lincoln's death, Johnson became the 17th President of the United States, at a time when the nation was shattered and struggling to heal from the devastating effects of the war. The presidency reconstruction begins. Johnson assumed the presidency during one of the most trying times in American history. The nation was still reeling from the death of Lincoln, and the South had been devastated by the war. The question of how to bring the Southern states back into the Union and how to rebuild the nation after such division and loss would define Johnson's presidency. Johnson, like Lincoln, believed in a swift and lenient approach to Reconstruction. He wanted to allow the Southern states to return to the Union with as little resistance as possible. He did not believe in the full equality of the newly freed slaves, and his approach was far more lenient than that of many in Congress, who wanted to impose harsher conditions on the South. In May 1865, Johnson announced his plan for Reconstruction, which included offering pardons to Southern whites who took an oath of allegiance to the Union, and allowing the Southern states to form new governments once they had ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. However, his lenient approach to Reconstruction clashed with the more radical Republicans in Congress, who wanted to impose much stricter measures on the South and secure rights for the newly freed African Americans. The impeachment, a divided presidency. By 1866, Johnson's relationship with Congress had deteriorated. His veto of several important Reconstruction bills, including the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and his efforts to remove key officials who opposed him, led to growing tension between the presidency and Congress. In 1867, Johnson famously clashed with the radical Republicans, and in an attempt to assert his power, he dismissed Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War, in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, a law passed by Congress to limit the President's power to remove officials. This led to Johnson's impeachment by the House of Representatives in 1868. He was accused of high crimes and misdemeanors, mostly related to his obstruction of Reconstruction efforts and violation of the Tenure of Office Act. However, in the Senate trial, Johnson narrowly avoided removal from office. By a single vote, the Senate acquitted him, and he remained in office for the remainder of his term, but his influence was severely weakened. Legacy: a controversial president. Andrew Johnson's presidency is one of the most controversial in American history. While he is credited with helping to restore the Southern states to the Union, his lenient policies toward the South, his opposition to civil rights for freed slaves, and his constant clashes with Congress have tarnished his legacy. Many historians view his presidency as one marked by missed opportunities to fully heal the nation, guarantees civil rights for African Americans, and ensure that Reconstruction was a success. Though Johnson did not face the same monumental challenges that Lincoln did, he failed to guide the nation through its difficult period of Reconstruction, and his impeachment reflects the deep divisions and struggles of post-war America. Reflection: the burden of leadership during Reconstruction. As we reflect on Andrew Johnson's presidency, we see a man who struggled to navigate the complex, contentious, and fraught terrain of Reconstruction. His presidency stands as a reminder that leadership in a time of division requires not just strength and resolve, but also an understanding of the moral and social imperatives of the moment. Thank you for joining me tonight as we reflect on the life and presidency of Andrew Johnson. Next time, we will turn to the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, a man who would lead the nation through the aftermath of the Civil War and into a new era of change. Until then, may the winds of history carry you softly into peaceful dreams. Episode 18. Ulysses S. Grant, the general who led the nation. Now we delve into the life of Ulysses S. Grant, a man whose name is forever tied to the Union's victory in the Civil War. Grant's path to the presidency began on the battlefields, where his skill and perseverance earned him the admiration of the nation. But his presidency, though marked by good intentions, would also face its own set of challenges and controversies. Let us now embark on a quiet journey through the life and legacy of Ulysses S. Grant. Early life from simple beginnings. Ulysses S. Grant was born on April 27, 1822, in Point Pleasant, Ohio, to Jesse Root Grant and Hannah Simpson Grant. His birth name was actually Hiram Ulysses Grant. But after a mix-up with his appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point, he became known as Ulysses S. Grant, a name that would forever become associated with victory and leadership. Grant grew up in a modest family. His father was a tanner and a merchant, and though the family was not wealthy, Grant had a strong work ethic from an early age. He was a quiet, introspective child who enjoyed math and animals, but he never showed a strong interest in the military until his teenage years at the age of 17. He entered West Point, where he was an average student, neither particularly brilliant nor overly lazy, but showed an aptitude for horsemanship. He graduated in 1843, ranked 21st in a class of 39 cadets. Early military service. The Mexican-American War. Grant's early military service was marked by the Mexican-American War, where he served as a second lieutenant under General Zachary Taylor. Although Grant's performance was solid, he did not particularly distinguish himself during the war. After the war, he continued his service in the army, though his career began to falter. He faced difficulties, including personal issues and problems with alcoholism, which led to his resignation from the army in 1854. Civil War. The general who saved the Union. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 would prove to be a turning point for Grant. He re-entered the military as a colonel in the Union Army, and his leadership abilities quickly rose to the surface. Grant's early campaigns in the war, including the Battle of Fort Donelson and the Battle of Shiloh, showed that he was a tenacious and decisive leader. By 1863, he had become a major general, and in 1864, President Abraham Lincoln appointed him as the General-in-Chief of the Union Army. Grant's leadership was instrumental in leading the Union to victory. His strategy of total warming, not just at defeating enemy armies but also at disrupting the Confederacy's infrastructure, was revolutionary. His relentless pursuit of Confederate forces, combined with his unwavering commitment to defeating the rebellion, made him the most respected military leader of the time. Grant's greatest triumph came in 1865, when he oversaw the surrender of General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, marking the official end of the Civil War. The presidency, Reconstruction, and challenges after the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant's reputation as a war hero made him a natural candidate for the presidency. In 1868, he was elected as the 18th President of the United States, taking office on March 4, 1869. As President. Grant's primary focus was on Reconstruction, the process of rebuilding the Southern states and integrating former Confederate states back into the Union. He strongly supported the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, granted citizenship to African Americans, and protected voting rights. Grant was also deeply committed to protecting the rights of African Americans, and he sought to enforce federal laws that would protect them from violence and discrimination in the South. However, Grant's presidency was marked by significant political and economic challenges. Though he worked to promote civil rights and equality, His administration was also marred by scandals and corruption. Several members of his administration were involved in illegal activities such as the Credit Mobilia scandal and the whiskey ring, which tainted his presidency and overshadowed many of his achievements. Grant's second-term economic struggles and political tensions. Grant was re-elected for a second term in 1872, but his second term was marked by worsening economic conditions. In 1873, the Panic of 1873 led to a severe economic depression, which caused widespread unemployment and financial instability. Grant's handling of the depression, though well-intentioned, was not enough to resolve the crisis. At the same time, tensions between the North and South continued to simmer, as Southern states sought to undermine the progress made by Reconstruction efforts. Grant attempted to enforce laws protecting African Americans, but the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan made it difficult to maintain law and order in the South. The end of Grant's presidency, a controversial legacy. Grant's second term ended in 1877, and while he left office with a legacy of military success and efforts to protect civil rights, his presidency was also marked by scandals, economic troubles, and political divisions. After leaving the White House, Grant retired from public life for a time, but in 1880 he briefly considered running for a third term. However, he was not successful, and his health began to decline in the final years of his life. Legacy: a complex and mixed record. Grant's legacy is a mixed one. On the one hand, his leadership during the Civil War ensured the preservation of the Union, and his efforts to protect the rights of African Americans during Reconstruction were admirable, even if not fully successful in the face of fierce opposition. On the other hand, his presidency was marred by corruption, political scandal, and economic instability, which has led some to question his effectiveness as a leader during the post-war years. Yet, despite these challenges, Grant is remembered as one of the great military leaders in American history. He played a key role in shaping the nation's future, and his legacy as a commander and champion of the Union remains firmly intact. Reflection: the weight of leadership. As we reflect on Ulysses Grant's life and presidency, we see a man who, though imperfect, dedicated himself to the service of his country at a pivotal time in its history. His story is a reminder that leadership, especially during times of great crisis, comes with both triumphs and tribulations. Thank you for joining me tonight as we reflect on the life and presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. Next time, we will turn to the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, who took office in the aftermath of Reconstruction and the turbulent post-war period. Until then, let the quiet winds of history carry you softly to peaceful dreams. Episode 19. Rutherford B. Hayes, the President who ended Reconstruction. Next, we turn our attention to Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th President of the United States, a man who assumed the presidency at a time when the nation was weary from years of war, division, and Reconstruction. His presidency marked the end of the turbulent era of Reconstruction, and it was a time of transition, healing, and at times compromise. Let us now embark on a quiet, reflective journey through the life and legacy of Rutherford B. Hayes. Early life: a steady and compassionate spirit, Rutherford Burkhard Hayes was born on October 4, 1822, in Delaware, Ohio, to Sophia Burkhard Hayes and Rutherford Hayes Sr. His father, a businessman, died of a fever just a few months before Rutherford was born, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings on her own. Despite this early hardship, Hayes's mother was deeply committed to his education, and he excelled. In his studies, he attended Kenyon College and later earned a law degree from Harvard Law School in 1845. After finishing his studies, Hayes began practicing law in Fremont, Ohio, and he quickly gained a reputation for his integrity and hard work. He married Lucy Webb in 1852, a woman of great character who would become an influential partner in his political career, military service, a soldier in the Civil War. When the Civil War began in 1861, Rutherford B. Hayes enlisted in the Union Army. He was initially appointed as a major and later promoted to brigadier general. Hayes fought in several important battles, including the Battle of South Mountain and the Battle of Cedar Creek, and he was known for his bravery and leadership on the battlefield. Hayes was wounded multiple times during the war, but he continued to serve with determination and earned the respect of his fellow officers and soldiers. His military service gave him the public visibility he would need for his future political career. In 1865, after the war ended, Hayes was mustered out of the military with the rank of Major General. Political beginnings. A moderate Republican after the war, Rutherford B. Hayes returned to Ohio and turned to politics. In 1867, he was elected governor of Ohio, and he would go on to serve 3 non-consecutive terms as governor, from 1868 to 1872, and then again in 1876 as a governor. Hayes was known for his moderate Republican views, and he worked hard to promote civil rights and educational reform. He also gained a reputation for being a reformer dedicated to fighting corruption in state government. He was particularly concerned with issues of public morality and economic fairness, which resonated with the people of Ohio. The 1876 election, a contested victory. In 1876, Hayes was nominated by the Republican Party to run for president. His opponent was Samuel J. Tilden, the Democratic candidate, and the election would become one of the most contested and controversial in American history. On Election Day, Tilden won a clear majority of the popular vote, but the results in several Southern states were disputed due to widespread voter fraud and intimidation. As a result, the election results were challenged, and a special electoral commission was created to resolve the dispute. After a long and bitter struggle, the commission awarded the disputed electoral votes to Hayes, giving him a narrow victory by a single electoral vote. With a final count of 185 to 184, the controversy surrounding the election led to widespread protests, and many Democrats felt that the results had been stolen from Tilden. This contentious election marked the beginning of a presidency that would require compromise and healing. The presidency, the end of Reconstruction. Hayes was sworn in as the 19th President of the United States on March 5, 1877, amid a storm of political tension and division. One of his first acts as president was to address the ongoing issue of Reconstruction. The Southern states, still reeling from the Civil War, had not fully integrated into the Union, and many African Americans continued to face violence, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. The Republicans, particularly the more radical members of the party, were committed to ensuring the protection of African American civil rights. But there was growing sentiment in the South for the end of federal intervention in the region. To bring about peace and reconciliation, Hayes made a difficult decision. He reached an agreement with Southern Democrats known as the Compromise of 1877, whereby he agreed to withdraw federal troops from the southern states, effectively ending Reconstruction. In return, Southern Democrats promised to respect the civil rights of African Americans, though, in practice, this promise was not fully kept, and many Southern states passed discriminatory laws such as Jim Crow laws, which segregated public spaces and disenfranchised black citizens. Economic policy, a period of stability. Despite the challenges in the South, Hayes worked to stabilize the country's economy. He supported measures to reduce corruption in government, particularly in customs duties, and he advocated for merit-based civil service reform, seeking to end the spoils system where political patronage was used to fill government positions. In 1878, Hayes signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which laid the foundation for the modern civil service system and sought to ensure that government jobs were filled based on ability, rather than political connections. Legacy: a presidency of compromise. Rutherford B. Hayes's presidency is often seen as a compromise, necessary but difficult transition period in American history. His decision to end Reconstruction and withdraw federal troops from the South was one of the defining moments of his administration, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the post-Civil War era. While his presidency did not result in widespread reform in the South, Hayes is often praised for his commitment to civil service reform, economic stability, and his attempts to heal a divided nation. He is remembered as a man who sought to do what was best for the country, even if it meant making difficult and unpopular decisions. Reflection: a quiet path to peace. As we reflect on the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, we see a man who navigated the delicate balance between reconciliation and justice, a president who inherited a nation torn by war and division, and who worked to ensure its peaceful return to unity, even if that meant sacrificing some of the promises made during Reconstruction. Thank you for joining me tonight as we reflect on the life and presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes. Next time, we will turn to the presidency of James A. Garfield, who would serve a tragically brief time in office, but whose impact would resonate through the years until then. May the winds of history gently carry you toward peaceful dreams. Episode 20. James A. Garfield, A Life Cut Short Tonight. We turn to the life of James A. Garfield, a man whose presidency was tragically shortened by an assassin's bullet, yet whose life and career offer a rich legacy of dedication, service, and the pursuit of knowledge. Garfield's story is one of unfulfilled promise, but also of a man who left an indelible mark on the history of America. Let us now walk gently through the life of James A. Garfield. Early life from humble beginnings. James Abram Garfield was born on November 19, 1831, in a small log cabin in Moreland Hills, Ohio. His father, Obijah Garfield, passed away when James was just a young child, leaving his mother, Eliza Ballou Garfield, to raise James and his siblings on her own. Despite the hardship of his early years, James was a curious and determined child. He worked on the family farm, but his passion for learning never wavered. At the age of 16, Garfield enrolled in the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram, Ohio, an institution where he would eventually become a professor. Garfield's academic abilities were evident, and he was soon offered the opportunity to continue his studies at Williams College in Massachusetts, where he graduated in 1856 with honors. A teacher and a preacher early career after college, Garfield returned to Ohio, where he became a teacher and also served as a preacher. His intellect and powerful speaking abilities made him a sought-after lecturer, and he quickly became a respected leader in the community. Garfield's early career was characterized by a deep commitment to education and public service. He believed in the power of knowledge to elevate individuals and society, and this belief would shape his later political career. In 1859, he married Lucretia Rudolph, a woman who would become his steadfast partner throughout his life. Together, they had 7 children. The Civil War, a leader in battle when the Civil War broke out in 1861. Garfield, like many young men of his time, felt the call to serve. He joined the Union Army as a lieutenant colonel and was quickly promoted to the rank of brigadier general. Garfield served with distinction in the Western theater of the war, fighting in significant battles such as the Battle of Shiloh and the Siege of Vicksburg. His leadership was marked by his ability to inspire those under his command, and his tactical skill earned him the respect of his superiors. One of Garfield's most notable moments in the Civil War came during the Battle of Middle Creek in 1862, where his forces decisively defeated the Confederate troops, securing a strategic victory for the Union. His efforts were crucial in maintaining Union control over Kentucky and Tennessee. By the end of the war, Garfield had risen to the rank of Major General. His military service helped to shape his public persona, and he returned to Ohio as a war hero, ready to pursue a career in politics. Political rise, a voice in Congress, Garfield's military reputation opened the door to a political career, and in 1863 he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he would serve for 9 terms from 1863 to 1880. During his time in Congress, Garfield established himself as a thoughtful and principled leader, advocating for the preservation of the Union, the rights of African Americans, and the expansion of civil rights. He was a strong supporter of Reconstruction and fought for the enforcement of federal laws to protect newly freed slaves. Garfield's intelligence and ability to articulate complex ideas made him an influential figure in Washington, and he became a member of the powerful House Appropriations Committee, where he worked to ensure proper funding for military veterans and public services. In addition to his political work, Garfield was deeply committed to education. He was a staunch advocate for the establishment of public schools and believed that a well-educated citizenry was the foundation of a strong republic. He also served as a trustee for Hiram College, his alma mater. The 1880 election, a contested nomination. In 1880, Garfield's political career took a dramatic turn when he became the Republican Party's nominee for the presidency. The election itself was highly contested, with the party divided between 2 factions: the stalwarts, who supported the political machine of Roscoe Conkling, and the half-breeds, who favored civil service reform. Garfield, though not initially a front-runner, was seen as a compromise candidate who could unite the 2 factions. His nomination was a victory of political negotiation and pragmatism. On November 2, 1880, Garfield won the election, defeating the Democratic candidate Winfield Scott Hancock by a narrow margin. He took office on March 4, 1881, inheriting a deeply divided nation. The presidency. A reformer with limited time, Garfield's presidency was one of potential, but it was tragically brief. During his time in office, he focused on civil service reform, an issue he felt strongly about after seeing the widespread patronage system in government. Garfield was determined to end the practice of awarding government jobs based on political favors and instead promote a merit-based system. Garfield also worked to strengthen the federal government and expand its role in economic and foreign affairs. But his presidency was cut short before he could enact many of his reforms. Assassination. A nation grieves. On July 2, 1881, just a few months into his presidency, Garfield was tragically shot by an assassin named Charles J. Guiteau, a disgruntled office-seeker who believed he was entitled to a government position in Garfield's administration. Garfield was shot at Washington, D.C.'s Union Station and rushed to the White House, where doctors tried to save his life. Despite their efforts, the wound became infected, and Garfield suffered for 2 months before he passed away on September 19, 1881. His death shocked the nation, and Garfield became a symbol of the need for civil service reform. His assassination led to the eventual passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883, which established the foundation for a more professional and nonpartisan federal workforce. Legacy. A president who never had time to fulfill his potential. James. Garfield's presidency, though short, left a lasting mark on American history. He is remembered as a man of great intellect, integrity, and ambition. His potential to enact significant reforms was tragically cut short by the violence that ended his life. But his commitment to merit-based government and his efforts to modernize the nation's institutions remain a key part of his legacy. Garfield's story is a reminder of the fragility of life and the potential within every leader. No matter how brief their time in office may be, reflection, a life of promise, as we reflect on the life and presidency of James A. Garfield. We remember a man who served his country with dedication, a man whose presidency was full of promise, though it was never fully realized. He was a leader who sought to bring fairness and efficiency to government, and though his life was tragically cut short, his ideals lived on. Thank you for joining me tonight as we remember the life of James A. Garfield. Next time, we will turn to the presidency of Chester A. Arthur, who assumed office after Garfield's death and navigated the country through the early years of the Gilded Age. Until then, may the quiet winds of history carry you gently to sleep.